So this is a project that we're just started up with the water quality section of Alberta Agriculture. There's a couple of folks at the University of Alberta as well, Drs. Suzanne Tank and Rolf Feinbrook. So it's kind of the first year of a 3 to 5 year project where we're trying to derive nutrient objectives for agricultural streams in Alberta. So what I'm going to be talking about is why we're setting objectives for agricultural streams, what do we mean by objectives, the process we're taking to set these objectives, and then again, as the Department of Agriculture, we need to assess the implications of those objectives to the agriculture industry. Okay, so why nutrient objectives for agricultural streams, and why is the Department of Agriculture doing this? It really stems from a few kind of landmark studies in the mid-90s through the early 2000s, where it's kind of joint federal and provincial initiatives looking at the effect of agriculture on water quality. So at the end of the day, as everybody probably knows now, is that if you increase the agricultural intensity, there's an associated increase in nutrient concentrations in surface water. But another key finding for those studies is that there's strong ecoregional differences. What do I mean by ecoregions? So these are just the large scale ecosystems in Alberta. So there's the major ones are the Grassland, the Parkland, and Boreal that are, where the agricultural activities is actually occurring. So the Parkland generally had much higher nutrients than the Grassland, so that kind of stood out in that particular study. So the Department of Agriculture came up with this initiative. So it's the Agricultural Water Quality Mitigation Continuum. So those particular studies fed the beginning components, so identifying the problems and the causes for water quality impairments. And then as we progress along the continuum, there's identifying and implementing solutions for water quality impairment until we achieve a desired outcome. Okay, so some of the kind of solutions aspects are historic studies by the department with a nutrient BMP evaluation project. So evaluating the environmental and economic trade-offs of farm-scale BMPs. And some of the findings there was that water quality improvements were seen at a edge-of-field scale. If we implement a BMP on a particular site, we notice a decline of nutrients from that particular landmass. But at the scope of the study, or the scale of the study, we didn't have broad watershed representation of BMPs, so we didn't notice a watershed scale improvement through the monitoring, but once you institute more of a watershed simulation and land use simulations at a watershed model, then we could demonstrate some improvements to water quality. Okay? So our current initiative is the Alberta Phosphorus Watershed project. So that objectives of that one are to develop the Alberta Phosphorus Management Tool, which is a tool to identify phosphorus transport risk and implement BMPs at a site-specific scale and at a watershed-wide scale as well, and evaluate the cumulative effects of BMPs on reducing phosphorus into these streams. And of course, our department is interested in the economic and social costs of that work as well. So what that is just an Excel-based tool that assesses the risk of phosphorus loss, and then the risk is based on both environmental and management practices. And it's very site-specific, so you take very specific field operations, and you plug it into the risk tool, and develop what are best practices that could be implemented to reduce the nutrient loss. Okay, so this project, where does it fit? This fits at the end, right? So if we know our problems, can identify some solutions, what are we going towards? What defines our success? Or when do we know that we're done with our watershed management, agricultural watershed management? And that's kind of a key knowledge gap that we have that we're trying to address with this study. So switching gears a little bit, so what do we mean by objectives? So these are the types of objectives according to me. Everyone seems to have their own interpretation. I can't misinterpret my own interpretation, so this is mine. So we have standards, and there's two, to me, there's two. There's kind of objectives, and there's guidelines or criteria. Objectives are more management-oriented, whereas the guidelines and the criteria are more regulatory. Regulation is not what we're after. We're looking at management goals, okay? So of those, so we have our kind of triggers, targets, limits, and then these are kind of borrowed from the Alberta Guide to Site-Specific Water Quality Objectives. So triggers are exceeded. If they're exceeded, management initiated. Targets are kind of the goals of watershed management, and then the limits are not to be exceeded because it protects the most sensitive land use. We purposely, at this point, are just calling them nutrient objectives because at the end of the day, we don't know how they're going to be rolled out in our watershed, our agricultural watershed management program. So, okay. So how are we setting the nutrient objectives? So in this study, there's been some previous work by our department looking at more kind of percentile approaches, so looking at the distribution of water quality or nutrients in water quality monitoring programs. In this study, we're looking at more stressor-response or effect-based relationships, or how do aquatic ecosystems respond to nutrients in these kind of prairie agricultural watersheds. So if we're looking at the scope, in this particular study, currently we're looking at the Parkland and the Grassland natural regions. So we have a bunch of sites spread all through these natural regions, because these are our kind of primary intensive agricultural areas. We do want to do the boreal transition, which also has a high incident of agricultural activity, but just don't have the resources currently to bring that in. And the type of stream that we're looking at are third and fourth order streams. Okay, so these, if you're not familiar with stream orders, it's just, if you look at it kind of a network, so the first order streams kind of feed it, when they combine, they turn into a 2, and the 2s into 3s, and so on. The 1s and 2s are really ephemeral, so it's really the third and fourth order that are kind of continuously flowing throughout the year, and generally those connect to the main stem rivers or other regulated water bodies, or other just water bodies of importance. Okay, so what do we mean? Stressor-response relationships. So all this is looking at a stressor or a gradient of stressors and the response of your key response of interest. So in this study, the stressor is nutrient concentration, so that's set by a kind of a gradient of nutrients. So that's why we have so many sites, is to develop kind of a gradient of nutrients from kind of low impact or low enrichment to high enrichment sites. And our responses are looking at ecosystem structure or aquatic ecosystem structure and aquatic ecosystem function. Okay. So in the Parkland, so this is our 2016 data. So we have 29 streams through the Parkland. If you see, we do have a nice kind of gradient, or we did manage to achieve a nice gradient of stressor, of nitrogen and phosphorus. Those lines that go across are just some literature guidelines or objectives that are out there just for the sake of comparison. And the same with the Grassland. We did manage to achieve a nice gradient as well. So we're quite confident that the sites that we chose offer a good opportunity to do a stressor-response relationship. In terms of the ecosystem responses, we're looking at both structure and function. So with structure, really that's just looking at the algae communities, both the biomass and the taxonomic composition, and how those respond or change to nutrients. And the function, we're looking at stream metabolism and nutrient retention. And I'll explain why we chose both of those different types of responses. So with the structure, it's just algae bioassessments. We're looking at both waterborne algae and algae biofilms, so kind of floating algae versus what's attached to substrates in the water that we put in the water. Okay, and we're also measuring a variety of things that could affect this relationship as well. So flow conditions, water clarity, light, aquatic plants that can compete for those nutrients, and trying to use those to, if we could explain away the kind of the variance associated with those parameters, then we could focus in on the relationship between algae growth and the nutrients in the water. Okay? And by function, so our one is stream metabolism. So this is just very cartoony, but essentially what we do is throw some instruments in the water to measure oxygen, and oxygen is just really a balance between photosynthesis and respiration. Okay? So this is kind of the output that gets generated by these things. And if you look at the bottom one, is more of a low impact system. So really, if you think about this is really just how the stream breathes. Okay, so it's the bottom one is just normal rhythmic breathing. And the top one, once you start to stress it through nutrient enrichment, then the breathing becomes very labored. So it's asthmatic versus just got a regular breathing. Okay. And another function that we're focusing on is kind of nutrient spiraling. So one of the key values that we want to preserve in these streams is their ability to retain nutrients and keep them from transporting directly downstream into say, the main stem rivers. Okay? So for that, what we're doing is just injecting salt solutions. So I don't have a picture of what our setup is. So we're not using rhodamine, which gives that pink color. We're just using chloride, phosphate, and ammonia. And then seeing how those transport downstream. So our hypothesis is that once in very enriched systems, the ability of that system to uptake added nutrients will be lowered. So it largely just kind of straight pipe, and the nutrient spiral length will just grow. Okay, so it won't have a good capacity to keep those nutrients that you add to the stream. So this is just a little overview of kind of landscape. So basically, you just inject it, you allow a mixing length, and then you sample a few locations downstream and determine attenuation rates based on your monitoring efforts. Okay. So what do we expect to see? Again, this is probably my interpretation of the expectations of this project. So if we have, say, a gradient of phosphorus, and if we look at algae biomass or a structural response, there'll be a point where there's going to be a change in the ecosystem. A certain concentration of phosphorus will get much higher biomass. But if we look at the functions, it's going to do the same. There's going to be more of a resilience of the ecosystem function to nutrient concentration. So there will be a point a little later in the spectrum where things like nutrient uptake velocity or net productivity will start to suffer, and that'll be more of a functional threshold. So we'll have both structure and function change. So if we apply this to the agricultural watershed programs, so if we have, say, 2 sites, and there's one where our existing concentrations of nutrients are above our kind of our functional limits, then we just want to bring or implement BMPs to bring the phosphorus concentrations to below that functional limit. So if we look at what we want out of an agricultural stream, if it's currently asthmatic in its existing state, we just want it to breathe normally. We don't necessarily have to bring it down to pristine so it can run marathons. We just want it to breathe normally, if that makes sense on why we chose the function as the target or the limit there. So conversely, if we want to maintain, if we're existing and we're below the structural objective, then if we surpass that, then we can enact management. Or conversely, if we're kind of within that kind of gray zone of structure and functional change, if we surpass our functional objective, then we bring it back down into a functioning ecosystem. So, implications of nutrient objectives. So this is an important thing for our department, is to assess if we implement these on the landscape or to the industry, what is that going to affect? Right? So the scale, we're looking at provincial application. So this is just a graphic of the grassland. All I'm trying to demonstrate is here is that our sites that were selected, the contributing land area to those sites, represent a fairly large area and diversity of the province. So it captures a lot of the differences in landscape and agricultural practices. So we feel they'd be representative and applicable to the broader provincial industry. Okay, and then looking at some of the determinants, or what drives ecosystem response to nutrients. So big questions here for us are, does the ecosystem nutrient response associate with agricultural land uses? So if we look at it from a kind of a landscape use and more GIS perspective, can we associate certain practices with nutrient enrichment and in turn aquatic ecosystem response? Or conversely, can we achieve healthy aquatic ecosystems by managing agricultural activity? Okay, so and in terms of assessing those objectives, we're going to be looking at environmental and economic feasibility of the nutrient objectives. So this is more of a a modeling or a simulation type approach. So one particular model that we use, or more commonly, is called the CEEOT model. So the CEEOT model integrates both landscape or environmental kind of watershed models with farm economic models to look at both the environmental effect and the economic effect of implementing beneficial management practices. So we have 2 sites. This is a very data-hungry and time-intensive process. So we have 2 sites where the CEEOT model is calibrated. So those are our focuses. One's in the Parkland, one's in the Grassland, and they have very historically high nutrient concentrations. Okay, so some of our previous work in implementing the CEEOT models in these watersheds, basically the process is to define BMP scenarios. So Indian Farm Creek and Three Hills both have their own sets of scenarios because there are differences in the dominant agricultural activity. So Indian Farm Creek is more livestock oriented. Three Hills Creek has more cropping practices in addition to livestock. Some of the results of implementing BMPs at the watershed scale, what we found was that under certain scenarios, we did manage to achieve 50 or 60% reduction in nitrogen loads, 50% reduction in phosphorus loads, and then certain scenarios had more of an economic impact. So scenario 5 had more of an economic impact of scenario 4, while offering the same level of environmental protection. Three Hills Creek, again, it was kind of more of a scatter, but the best ones were more of a like 25% reduction in nitrogen, 15% reduction in phosphorus. And so those simulations were based on loading to the systems. But what we need to do next is adapt those CEEOT models to output concentrations instead of loads. So we can determine the in-stream concentrations if we're going to be able to achieve those nutrient objectives that we're setting throughout the rest of the study. Okay? And then we can just assess the achievability of the objectives from that regard. Right? So we need to define success, the definition of success will be more of a temporal, what percentage of the time are these objectives met? Because we're not going to meet the objective. If we set the objectives in the growing season or like late spring or early summer, based on those responses to nutrients, we're not going to achieve those in the spring, in the snowmelt runoff. So we need to recognize that and say, okay, well, we're going to have 80% of the time. If that meets our objectives, then we're good. And then from there, we need to compare the simulated concentrations to the objectives and then look at both the environmental feasibility of achieving those objectives and then the economic implications of that as well. So let's put it together. So nutrient objectives, or we're just trying to define targets for agricultural watershed management. And in deriving the nutrient objectives, we're looking at aquatic ecosystem responses to a nutrient gradient. And we need to assess the implications of those derived objectives before we as a department will promote them. So I'll just acknowledge our funding through Alberta Innovates. Our partners is my department and the University of Alberta, and then our stakeholder groups, which are Environment and Parks, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, Watershed Alliance, North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance, and the Intensive Livestock Working Group.